In the year 65, in the age of the Roman Empire, a messenger arrived at a villa outside Rome. The man who received him was 69 years old, a philosopher, a playwright, a statesman, the wealthiest private citizen in the Roman Empire. The messenger carried a letter from the emperor. The letter contained a single instruction: die. Not an accusation, not a trial, not a public execution, just a private order. You are to take your own life. Tonight. The man read the letter, set it down, and began to give instructions to his household, calmly, without panic, without pleading, as if he had been expecting this moment for a very long time. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca. And the story of how the man who wrote the most powerful philosophy of equanimity in human history came to be killed by his own student is one of the darkest, most complicated, most human stories antiquity ever produced. This is not a philosophy lecture. It is not a summary of Stoic principles. It is the story of a man who spent his entire life writing about how to live with integrity, while living a life of almost impossible contradiction. A man who preached the irrelevance of wealth while accumulating one of the greatest fortunes in Roman history. A man who wrote about the courage to face death, who spent years helping a monster stay in power. A man whose ideas have outlived every emperor, every dynasty, every empire that tried to use or destroy him, and who died at the end on his own terms, exactly as he had always written that a person should. Who Seneca was before the power. Seneca was born around 4 BC in Cordoba, in what is now Spain. His father was a wealthy Roman knight with literary ambitions. His mother was exceptionally educated for a woman of her time. From childhood, Seneca was brilliant, dangerously brilliant. The kind of mind that absorbs everything and questions everything immediately after. He was brought to Rome as a young man. He studied philosophy, rhetoric, science. He became a lawyer. He became a senator. He became, by his early 30s, one of the most admired writers and speakers in Rome. And then, the Emperor Caligula noticed him. Caligula's reaction to Seneca's brilliance was the reaction of every insecure, powerful person throughout history. Threat. He ordered Seneca executed. Seneca was saved, apparently, by a courtier who convinced Caligula that Seneca was already dying of tuberculosis and would be dead within months anyway. It was almost certainly a lie, but it worked. Seneca survived Caligula. He would spend the rest of his life surviving emperors, the exile under the next emperor, Claudius. Seneca's luck ran out differently. He was accused of adultery with the emperor's niece. The charge was almost certainly false, a political fabrication by enemies at court. It didn't matter. He was exiled to Corsica for 8 years. 8 years on an island at the edge of the Roman world, far from Rome, from his career, from everything he had built. During those 8 years, he wrote letters, essays, philosophical meditations. Some of the most important Stoic texts ever produced were written by a man in exile, by a man who had lost everything except his mind, and his mind refused to be exiled with him. There is something worth sitting with here. The circumstances that produced Seneca's greatest work were the circumstances of his destruction. The exile that was meant to silence him gave him the silence he needed to think. The loss of everything external forced him to examine what was internal. Every letter he wrote from Corsica was a letter written from the knowledge that comfort is temporary. Status is borrowed, and the only thing that cannot be taken from you is how you choose to meet what happens. He did not just write this, he was living it every single day. The return and the devil's bargain. In 49 AD, Seneca was recalled to Rome, not by mercy, by strategy. Agrippina, the mother of the young Nero, wanted a tutor for her son. She needed someone brilliant, respected, and politically useful. She chose Seneca, and Seneca accepted. This decision has puzzled historians for 2,000 years. The man who wrote about the corrupting influence of power walked directly into the most corrupted environment in the Roman world. The man who wrote about the danger of proximity to tyrants became the closest advisor to the boy who would become the most infamous tyrant in Roman history. Why? The honest answer is that we don't fully know. Perhaps he believed he could influence Nero toward wisdom. Perhaps he believed that proximity to power was the only way to limit its damage. Perhaps, after 8 years of exile, he simply wanted to come home. Perhaps all three. What we know is what happened next. For 8 years, Seneca co-governed the Roman Empire. Together with the general Burrus, he ran the administration while Nero performed the role of emperor. These 8 years, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, were, by most historical accounts, the best years of Nero's reign, relatively just, relatively stable, relatively sane, because Seneca was there, steering, advising, containing. What Seneca knew about Nero? There is a letter Seneca wrote during this period that reveals something almost unbearable about his situation. He writes about the difficulty of maintaining one's own character when surrounded by people who have none. He writes about the way proximity to corruption works on even the most disciplined mind. Slowly, almost invisibly, like water finding cracks in stone. You accommodate one thing, then another, and one day you look up and realize that the accommodations have accumulated into something you would not have recognized in yourself. Seneca was describing himself. He knew it. He wrote about it directly, and yet he stayed, because leaving would have been worse, because the alternative to Seneca advising Nero was Nero advised by no one, or advised by someone far more willing to say yes to everything. The man who wrote about the courage to walk away stayed because he understood something that his philosophy could not fully contain, that sometimes the most moral choice is the least clean one. The wealth problem. There is another uncomfortable truth about Seneca that his admirers have always had to reckon with. He was extraordinarily wealthy, obscenely wealthy, in a period when Rome was experiencing economic hardship, when provinces were being taxed into poverty. Seneca's personal fortune was estimated at 300 million sesterces. He owned multiple villas. He lent money across the empire at interest. He was, by any measure, exactly the kind of man his own philosophy condemned. His critics noticed. A satirist named Publius Suilius attacked him publicly. By what wisdom? By what philosophical teachings? Had Seneca accumulated 300 million sesterces in 4 years of imperial friendship? It was a fair question. Seneca's answer in his essays was essentially this: wealth is not the problem. Attachment to wealth is the problem. I hold it loosely. It could be taken tomorrow, and I would not grieve. Whether this was genuine or whether it was the sophisticated rationalization of a man who liked being rich is a question he took to his grave. What is certain is this: he knew the contradiction, he wrote about it, he never resolved it, and he never pretended to. The fall Nero grew up, and as Nero grew into his power, he grew out of his need for Seneca. The murders began. First his stepbrother Britannicus, then his own mother Agrippina. Seneca helped draft the letter to the Senate explaining the matricide. This is the moment most historians find hardest to defend. The philosopher who wrote about the sanctity of human life wrote the cover story for a son who murdered his mother. Seneca knew what he was doing. He did it anyway, because by this point, leaving was no longer possible. He had been in the room too long. He had seen too much. He knew too much. Men who know too much about emperors. Do not retire quietly, he tried. Twice Seneca approached Nero and asked to be released, to retire, to give back the wealth, to leave. Nero refused both times because Seneca's presence was useful. His reputation gave Nero's regime a credibility it could not generate on its own. The philosopher's name attached to the emperor's actions made them seem less monstrous. Seneca was a shield, and shields are not released simply because they ask to be. The letter in 65 AD, a conspiracy to assassinate Nero, was uncovered, the Pisonian conspiracy. Seneca's involvement was unclear. He may have known about it. He may have been intended as Nero's replacement. He denied everything. It didn't matter. Nero used the conspiracy as the excuse he had been looking for. The messenger arrived at the villa. The letter was read, and Seneca prepared to die. What happened next was recorded by the historian Tacitus, and it is one of the most extraordinary accounts in ancient literature. Seneca gathered his friends. He told them not to weep. He said that he was leaving them the most valuable thing he possessed, the image of his life. He opened his veins. The blood flowed slowly. He was old and his body did not cooperate. He took poison. It didn't work quickly enough. He was carried to a steam bath. He suffocated in the steam. Throughout all of it, he kept talking, dictating to his secretaries, discussing philosophy until the very end. He died as he had lived, thinking out loud, refusing to stop. The contradiction that was his life. Seneca was not a saint. He was not a hypocrite in the simple sense, either. He was something more complicated, a man who understood truth clearly and lived in circumstances that made acting on that truth almost impossible. He wrote about freedom while serving emperors. He wrote about the emptiness of wealth while accumulating it. He wrote about the courage to die while spending years avoiding it. And in his final hour, he demonstrated every principle he had ever written about the equanimity in the face of death, the comfort to others before comfort to himself, the refusal to waste, the time remaining on grief or anger, the mind continuing to work until the body could no longer support it. His letters survived, 124 of them written to a young friend named Lucilius about time, about friendship, about fear, about death, about how to live when living is hard. They have been read continuously for 2,000 years. They are being read right now by people who have never heard of Nero, who could not name a single Roman emperor, but who recognize in the words of a man who died in a steam bath in 65 AD, something true about their own lives. That is the answer to the question Seneca spent his whole life circling. What survives? Not the wealth, not the villas, not the political influence, not even the good years of Nero's reign that he helped create. What survives is the thought, the letter, the sentence that lands in someone's chest 2,000 years later and makes them feel less alone. Seneca knew this. He wrote it explicitly. I am not writing for today. I'm writing for posterity. He was right. VeilMind. Decode the hidden rules of the mind. They never taught you this in school.